Brought to you by theoretical physicist, futurist, popularizer of science, and world-renowned author, Professor Michio Kaku.
And GCNlive.com.
This is Science Fantastic.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic every week, we profile some of the most amazing developments in science and technology. And we've had a number of Nobel Prize winners, number of leading thinkers talking about black holes, maybe even time travel, wormholes, all the stuff you see in the movies. But today, we're going to talk about the most mysterious, the most complex object in the known universe. We've scanned the heavens out to billions of light years. And the most complex object in the known universe is sitting on your shoulders right now, the human brain, with over 100 billion neural connections. And what about a metaphor? Is there a metaphor that helps to explain this most complex object? Well, the ancient Egyptians thought that the brain was useless, and they threw it away when they embalmed the pharaoh. During the Middle Ages, the mind became a battlefield. A battlefield between, on one hand, the devil and sin and temptation on one hand, and on the other hand, the land of the angels, the land of faith and salvation. Then during the Industrial Revolution, with the coming of the steam engine, Sigmund Freud comes along and says, no. The brain is a steam engine where pressure builds up in one area and can overwhelm all the valves and gauges in another part of the brain. And the steam engine had three parts to it. One part was the id, that is your basic sense of self, the superego, which is your guilty conscience, and your libido, that is desire. So the brain was a steam engine. And then with the coming of electricity, people said, no, the brain is a switchboard. Nothing but a gigantic switchboard, just like a telephone network. Then with the coming of digital computers and transistors, people said, no. The brain is a Turing machine with inputs, outputs, basic programming, all hooked together with transistors. Well, now we have yet another metaphor coming from the world of artificial intelligence. And we've had a number of those people on Science Fantastic, and they say, no. The brain is not a steam engine. It's not a telephone switchboard. It's not any of these things. The brain is a pattern-seeking learning machine. That's what it's all about. Well, with us today is Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett. She's a distinguished professor at Northeastern University with appointments at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital. And she's the author of a delightful new book that I highly recommend, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. So today we're going to talk about the most mysterious object in the universe, the human brain. Well, Lisa, I just finished reading your book a few days ago, and the question naturally occurs then, what is the basic correct metaphor for the human brain? You mentioned something like energy budgets. Could you elaborate?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on your show. I think that we can talk about the way the brain is structured, or we can talk about the way the brain functions, or the way it works, or we can talk about its most important job. And its most important job from an evolutionary standpoint is to control the systems of your body. So brains didn't evolve to think or feel or see. They evolved to control the systems of an animal's body. And I describe this using the metaphor of a budget. So your brain is constantly running a budget for your body. It's not budgeting money, it's budgeting glucose and water and salt and oxygen and all of the nutrients that are needed to keep you alive and well, to perform nature's most important task, which is for you to pass your genes on to the next generation. And have those offspring survive to reproduce themselves. And so you can think about every movement that you make, everything that you learn, every food that you eat, every hug that you give or receive, every kindness that you offer, every insult that you bear as a deposit or a withdrawal in that body budget.
Okay. Now, in your book, you mention in your first lesson, because you have 7.5 lessons, your first lesson is that the brain is 1, not 3. Well, there is a theory, which is actually rather popular, that says the brain is in basically 3 parts. The back of the brain is the reptilian brain, the oldest brain, the brain of territoriality, food, mating. That's the back of the brain. Then the center of the brain is the monkey brain, the limbic brain. That is the brain of social interactions, pack mentality, emotions. That's the center of the brain. And then the front part of the brain is the prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking brain. But you say that picture is outdated. Could you elaborate?
Sure. In ancient Greece, Plato told a story that was a morality story about what it means to be a moral human being. And his story described the human psyche, which we understand to be something similar to a human mind, as having 3 parts that he described as 2 horses and a charioteer. One horse stands in for instincts, like freezing and fleeing and fighting and reproducing, what scientists call the 4 Fs. One horse represented emotion or passions, and these 2 represent your inner beast, which is in constant struggle with the charioteer, who represented rationality. And Plato's story was that when rationality controls your inner beast, you are moral. And when rationality fails to control your inner beast, and therefore you do and say things which are ill-advised, you're either immoral or, in modern terms, maybe you're not mentally healthy. And this morality story was basically stamped onto the anatomy of the brain in the mid-20th century. Because when you look at a lizard brain, it looks like it doesn't have a cerebral cortex. And when you look at a rat brain, it looks like, there's a very, very, very small cerebral cortex, and compare that to a monkey brain or a human brain where the cerebral cortex looks big. And so the assumption was that the human brain evolved in layers, that first we have a lizard brain, which is supposed to contain the circuits for instincts, and layered on top of that evolved a limbic system, limbic meaning border, the tissue that borders the lizard brain, for emotions. And then layered on top of that is the cerebral cortex, which is important for rationality, particularly the front part, or what you termed prefrontal cortex. And certainly if you look at lizard brains versus rat brains versus human brains, you can see that to the naked eye, the structures look very different. But when you peer deep into the molecular genetics of the cells, what you can see is that genetically, based on the genes contained in those cells, there are no new types of neurons in the human brain relative to any other mammalian brain. That is, that cats and dogs and rats and anteaters and so on have exactly the same types of neurons that human brains have. It's just that as brains become larger over evolutionary time, they reorganize themselves in interesting and important ways. So the interesting piece of information here, I think, is that, as you pointed out, this is a really, really popular story of brain evolution and brain function. People talk about, their lizard brain hijacking the rest of the brain and so on.
Okay, Lisa, we have to take a short commercial break, but after the break, we're going to continue a discussion of your new book, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku as we explore with Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett one of the most complex objects in the known universe, and that is the human brain. And by the way, if you want to know more about Science Fantastic, go to my website, mkaku.org, mkaku.org. I've written 4 New York Times bestsellers, and we have on Facebook 4 million fans on Facebook. Well, Elisa, in the common popular literature, there's something called the marshmallow test, where you give children a choice of eating a marshmallow immediately or delaying it for a few hours, and then you get 2 marshmallows if you delay it. And that's supposed to be a metaphor for the conflict between the emotion for instant gratification, that is the desires of wanting to eat the marshmallow, versus the rational objective of delaying it and then having 2 marshmallows a few hours later. Well, has that held up? In other words, delayed gratification, is that one of the keys to success in life? Has some of these popular theories held up?
I think it's fairly safe to say that the concept of delayed gratification is something that most people are familiar with, and yes, it is related to success in many studies. But the explanation that you have one part of your brain which is emotional and a different part of your brain which is rational, and they're in battle for your behavior, is not really a correct explanation for delayed gratification.
And so you mentioned that it's an energy budget and time. That is time that evolution allotted to develop certain parts of the brain. So given the new thinking that you present, how do we look back at this earlier thinking that the brain evolved from the back, the lizard brain, and evolved in the front direction toward the center of the brain, the limbic brain, and finally to the front of the brain, which is the thinking human brain? How does that theory then have to be reinterpreted from your point of view?
I think the evidence shows really clearly that you have one brain. You have one brain made up of, in a human case, approximately 128 billion neurons. And those 128 billion neurons are constantly talking to each other and creating patterns. And those patterns, that's what your behavior and your experience emerge out of those patterns. And one of the interesting things that your brain is doing constantly is using your past to predict your future, using your past experience to predict what's going to happen to you in a moment from now or 10 minutes from now or 2 hours from now. And out of understanding this dynamic, we can explain things like delay of gratification and other phenomena that we're used to experiencing.
Okay, well, let's do a science experiment. I'm a scientist. Let's go home tonight and try to teach your dog the meaning of tomorrow. Well, you'll find that dogs do have a sense of time, but the sense of tomorrow is beyond their comprehension, or at least we've never measured their ability to understand tomorrow, the next month, the next year. So in part 4, your 4th lesson, you mentioned that the human brain is a prediction machine. So is that one of the main characteristics that separate us from the animals? That we do not live in the present. We don't live with instinct. We daydream. We think about the future. We think about a world even after we're dead. Animals don't do that to the best of our knowledge. So isn't that one of our defining characteristics as humans, that we are prediction machines?
I might put it a little differently. As far as we know, every brain on this planet is a prediction machine. It's just that an animal's brain will predict as far into the future or the past, using the past as is relevant for that animal's environment. So for humans, as you said, we actually have a lot of trouble staying in the present because we have brains that can do mental time travel so easily. We can remember into the past over decades, and we can imagine futures that are 20, 30, 40 years from now, and sometimes even hundreds or thousands of years from now. A dog has also the capacity to predict, as we learned in Ivan Pavlov's famous experiments that he won the Nobel Prize for. But they predict on a much shorter time scale. And even single-cell creatures like bacteria can predict. They don't have brains. They have organelles that allow them to predict. And they're predicting on the order of minutes, not on the order of weeks or months or years.
Okay, and some people even make the next jump, and that is that our ability to see the future, to predict alternate realities that don't exist, to see all the complexities of our decisions is related to intelligence. That people who are not, quote unquote, so intelligent simply live in the immediate, the present, immediate gratification. What's in it for me now? While people who are more thoughtful, more forward-looking, quote, more intelligent, unquote, are the ones who see different alternate futures and pick the best ones. So the question is, has that held up? And for that matter, what about IQ? Has that held up after all these decades?
I think it's important to remember that IQ is the discussion about what IQ is somewhat different than the discussion of what intelligence is, in the following sense. IQ measures IQ is whatever an IQ test measures. It's a set of little tests that you take that predict how well you do on IQ tests. And it might predict how well you do in school, and in very narrow, it predicts narrowly how well you're going to do, but it doesn't necessarily predict how well you're going to do in life. And some scientists think that there are many different types of intelligence. But I think one marker of intelligence is the capacity to create new knowledge out of what you already know. And the human brain, has this really amazing capacity to take bits and pieces of past experience and combine them in novel ways to create new knowledge, to be innovative, to be creative. And this is something that other animals do, but human brains do it really to a remarkable extent.
Okay, also, lesson number 7 in your book talks about the fact that the brain creates its own reality, a social reality, that laws, for example, don't exist in physics. There's no physics of laws. Laws are nothing but molecules floating in the air as far as a physicist is concerned. But to a human being, laws are reality, that you have to do certain things or else you go to jail. So tell us a little bit about the fact that the brain lives in an imaginary world of social reality, that the brain creates a new kind of reality that animals don't have.
Right. So human brains can do many things that individually animals can do, maybe one or two of those things, but we can do them all together. We can communicate with each other, we can learn from each other, we can cooperate with each other, we can be creative with each other, and we also have the capacity to impose a function on something that it doesn't physically have on its own. So if you and I agree that a piece of paper is money, then we can trade that piece of paper for material goods like food. And that is social reality, the ability to collectively agree to impose a function on something that it doesn't normally have by virtue of its physical nature. And then, poof, that reality exists. We do this all the time. In fact, almost all of civilization is this kind of reality. And it's a kind of reality that exists only when human brains are working together, whether they know it or not.
Okay, and also lesson number 6 in your book also helps to differentiate us from the animal kingdom, and that is that there's actually more than one kind of mind. We have one brain, of course, but the brain can exist in different minds and different mindsets, while animals have difficulty doing that. Could you elaborate?
Sure. A human brain is born under construction, meaning an infant brain is not a miniature adult brain. It's a brain that's waiting for wiring instructions from the world. And that world is a physical world, but it's also a social world. The way that we interact with our infants actually wires their brains to experience and act in particular ways. And one thing that we're doing is we are communicating information about a particular culture.
We have to take yet another short commercial break. Once again, you are listening to Science Fantastic. Our special guest is Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett. The book is called 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. And if you want to give us a call at 612-564-8135. Leave your name, call letter to the radio station or the website, and the city you're calling from, and maybe you can get on 100 radio stations that carry Science Fantastic. So stay tuned as we continue to talk about the most mysterious object in the known universe sitting on your shoulders right now.
This is Science Fantastic.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again, our special guest today is Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett. She's a distinguished professor in neuroscience at Northeastern University with appointments at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital. And the book is called 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. Well, before we continue a discussion of the brain in your book, let's talk a little bit about Hollywood and how Hollywood portrays the brain. There's an urban legend that says that we only use 10% of our brain, that therefore 90% of our brain is unused, and if only we can tap into that 90%, we could become almost superhuman. Well, some scientists have tried to trace where that legend came from, and apparently that legend came from a comic book back in the 1950s. At the end of the comic book, they sometimes had trivial facts about science, and of course they would make up a lot of these facts, but apparently that's where it comes from. But now we have Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud says, well, there's an unconscious brain, a brain that is beyond our conscious realm, and it influences our thinking even without our knowledge. So, Lisa, what is the latest concerning whether or not we only use 10% of our brain? And was Freud correct in saying that there's an unconscious mind?
Well, you use all of your brain all of the time. I think that's pretty clear. The evidence suggests that you're not using 10% of your brain. You're probably using more like 85 or 95% of your brain for every action you take and every experience you have. Most of what your brain is doing is unconscious. That is, most of what is happening in your brain you don't have awareness of or access to. That's correct.
Okay. Well, moving on, you have many, many chapters in your book that are quite profound. Let's take a few of them. First of all, in chapter 2, you say that the brain, as a metaphor, is a network. So what do you mean by that the brain is a network?
Yeah, actually what I say is the brain is as a network is not a metaphor. That's actually a description of the brain's organization. So unlike saying that the brain has 3 layers, or that the brain, you have a left side and a right side and so on, those are metaphors. But the brain as a network means that you have 128 billion neurons which are working together, and they're passing information back and forth, and the patterns they create allow you to have the thoughts and feelings and actions that you have. And it would be a metaphor to explain that network in relation to, say, the global network for air travel, which is what I do in the essay, in the lesson. So comparing your brain to the way that air travel works around the world, the way that airports work and air flights work and so on, that is a metaphor.
Okay. And also, again, using Hollywood as our main source of information for the public about the brain, there's something called the left brain and the right brain, where, at least in the popular literature, the left brain is more analytical, more focused, and the right brain is more holistic, more emotional, and less rational. And the two, of course, work together to create your personality. But has that held up, the left brain, right brain idea? Is that correct or not?
Not really, not to our knowledge. So I would say that when it comes to processing language, it's clear that for many people, in fact, for most people, the left part of the brain has more...
Okay, let's take another short commercial break. But after the break, we're going to continue a discussion of the book 7.5 Lessons About the Brain by Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett. And you are listening to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Give us a call at 612-564-8135, and maybe you can get on 100 radio stations that carry Science Fantastic.
This is Science Fantastic.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Today we're talking about the most complex object in the known universe. Scanning the stars in the heavens out to billions of light years, the most complex object in the known universe is sitting on your shoulder right now. So we're talking about 7.5 lessons about the brain with Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett. She's a distinguished professor of neurology at Northeastern University with appointments at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital. Where we last left off, we were talking about the fact that, well, Hollywood gives us a lot of our information about the human brain, but how much of it is really fact-based and scientifically correct? One Hollywood lore is the fact that we have two hemispheres of the brain, left and right. The left brain controls language and controls mathematical ability, is the analytic brain that focuses on something. The right brain tends to be more holistic, tends to be more emotional, tends to look at the big picture. But, well, let's talk to a scientist. Has that basic dichotomy held up or not?
Yes, when it comes to language, primarily, and no when it comes to everything else. When we process language and we form words and sentences, most people tend to use more of their left brain than their right brain. We're not born that way, but we develop that way. For some people, it's the opposite. They use more of their right brain than their left brain for language. But for most people, it's more of the left brain for language. But for all other functions, it's really distributed across both hemispheres. There's no difference in terms of analytical versus holistic thinking or anything like that.
Okay, well, moving on, in the third lesson in your book, you talk about little brains wire themselves. So we're talking about upbringing now. So how does the young mind interact with caregivers and thrive or not thrive in that circumstance?
Little brains are born under construction. They are waiting for wiring instructions from the world. Those wiring instructions can come from the physical world, the sights and sounds and smells of the physical world. So, for example, an infant's ability to see won't develop normally unless light waves are hitting the retina, the infant's eye, and being taken up to the brain. And similarly, some of those wiring instructions come from the social world. When we hug our babies, when we feed our babies, when we make eye contact with our babies, talk to our babies, sing to our babies, and so on, this social interaction is necessary for an infant's brain to wire itself normally. And this is how we transmit cultural information from one generation to the next to create different kinds of minds.
Now, there's a phenomenon called wolf children, children that were abandoned during the Middle Ages for reasons we don't understand, children that thrived or had to thrive in the forest or they would die of starvation. And a lot of these wolf children throughout history have been captured, have been analyzed, and they don't speak a language. Your period at which you can learn a language bypassed them, and they never really learn social skills. They never really learn how to become human. So doesn't that mean, therefore, that our upbringing has an awful lot to do with our ability to speak a language and to understand social cues?
Yes. Basically, we have the kind of nature that requires a nurture. We have the kind of genes that require that we have social interactions with people in order to learn the things that we need to learn to live a human life. So it's not that genes are unimportant, it's that genes give us the capacity to wire our brains to the world that we live in. And that is, in part, what makes us human.
And if we're deprived of that, how do we turn out? I mean, some people, of course, blame their childhood on all sorts of problems they have as adults. But how does it work? If you are socially deprived as a child, what happens when you grow up and become an adult?
Well, there's a difference between having adversity in your background as a child and being really deprived of any social contact whatsoever. So what we know is that we need some contact with other people to develop normally.
Okay, Lisa, we have to take another short commercial break, but after the break, we're going to continue a discussion of your book, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain.
This is Science Fantastic.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again, our special guest today is Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett, author of a new book, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, which of course is the most complex, most mysterious object in the entire known universe. Well, before the break, we were talking about upbringing and whether or not we can blame how we turned out on our upbringing. However, there is a professor, Professor Licken, that has analyzed twins that were separated at birth and tried to see if there's a correlation between youthful upbringing and adult behavior, including crime. And he said there's a statistical relationship between children who are unsocialized, fatherless, and male, and becoming a criminal. Now, of course, the correlation is not 100%, but in the main, just looking at the raw statistics, he claims, unsocialized, fatherless males tend to make up most of our criminals. So what are your thoughts? Have these things held up? That is, studies of children and tracing them over the decades to see how they turn out as adults?
I think that's a pretty extreme claim, actually. So the fact that most people who are arrested and convicted of a crime, especially violent crimes, are male, I think that is pretty well known. But the idea that someone who is fatherless is therefore unsocialized is I think an assumption. That's an assumption that goes maybe a little bit too far. Normally, brains require the input to develop normally require social interaction with other people, including caregivers who love and take care of those children. And in extreme circumstances where children are deprived, not children who are in adversity, meaning that they're deprived of some social care, but children who are completely deprived of social care don't develop normally. We know that from the Romanian orphanage situation where children were warehoused in orphanages. I think, as far as I know, the predictors of criminality are highly varied, and I don't think that other than being male, I don't know that the rest of those statements are really defensible.
Okay, let me ask you another question about human nature. Some people think that there's a core set of values that we consider human nature. Other people have said, no, there are personality types. For example, I read one article which said that there are about 9 or so, plus or minus, distinct personality types that are reproducible. You can test these statistically that, yes, people tend to be pigeonholed in these categories. But what are your thoughts? Is there simply one core human nature, or are there many, many distinct personalities, which is a reproducible, testable idea?
As far as we know, when it comes to humans, variation is the norm, meaning that there is no set of core personality characteristics or features that characterize every human on this planet. For every feature that you can think of that you want to claim as universal, you can find someone who doesn't have it. And even for classification systems of personality, they are not. There's really no classification system that anybody has come up with that is universal across all humans on the planet.
Okay, well, also lesson number 6 in your book talks about the fact that the brain can make more than one kind of mind, that we are in some sense plastic, and our brains can actually go back and forth between different kinds of universes, different kinds of worlds. So how does that work? And is it possible that you can have, therefore, multiple personalities? That's another Hollywood theme found in several movies, that a person is unaware of the fact that there are several personalities living in the same brain. Is that just a bunch of nonsense that Hollywood has cooked up? Or are multiple personalities really possible?
Well, I think there's a big scientific debate about whether multiple personalities are possible. It's certainly great entertainment, and particularly when you need, villains in a superhero movie. But in general, what I would say is that it is true that the human brain bathes in interactions with other human brains can create more than one kind of mind. We have different cultures, and we have people, and those cultures are very, very different from one another. For example, in our culture, we have thoughts and feelings, and in other cultures, people don't distinguish a thought from a feeling. For them, it's the same kind of event. So because we are born under construction, we can transfer different cultural knowledge to those human brains and create different kind of minds. And if we go from one culture to another as adults, we can acculturate. We can learn the customs and values and behaviors of that culture, and have more than one kind of a repertoire of experiences and behaviors. But that isn't really, I wouldn't describe that as having lots of different personalities. If I did, it would be a very colorful metaphor that I would use at a dinner party.
Okay, also, you mentioned evolution many times in your book, but if you take a look at the dinosaurs were around for over 200 million years, and none of them, not a single one, to the best of our knowledge, developed a large brain like us. So the question is, why did we develop a large brain? Some people say that the dinosaurs were well suited for their environment, therefore there was no need to become intelligent. Well, any thoughts? Because we have to wind up at the present time, unfortunately. Any thoughts? We have about a minute.
We developed a large brain in stages. But probably the notion is that we developed very large bodies and we lived together in groups, and that produced a lot of variability that we had to deal with, which required large brains.
Okay, well, once again, our special guest is Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett. You are listening to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku, and the hotline number is 612-564-8135. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we profile the amazing, jaw-dropping scientific discoveries that are revolutionizing our world and touching our lives. And in this hour, once again, we're going to throw the lines open. This hour is your hour. This hour is dedicated to you. If you're listening to the radio, watching television, surfing the web, maybe you come across a science story that captures your imagination. Something about space, something about our world, something about DNA, something about cancer research, health, but there's no one to talk to. You're all by yourself. Well, you can talk to me. That's right. You can give me a call and have your thoughts heard on national radio. The number to call is 612-564-8135. Write that number down. 612-564-8135. All we ask is that you leave your name, call letters of the radio station you're listening to, if you're listening to one, and the city you're calling from, and then ask that question. Make that comment that's always been bothering you. Also, today I'm actually recording from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm speaking at a science conference here. A lot of engineers and scientists will be in the audience. But of course, I'm not that far away from Roswell, New Mexico, where some people think a flying saucer crashed back in 1947, hushed up by the military. And once I actually sponsored a debate on radio. On one hand, we had a representative from the United States Air Force, a retired Air Force official who said, bah, humbug, none of this nonsense about aliens from outer space. It's all trumped up. And then on the other side, we had a true believer, an author of several books about the Roswell incident, who believed that the Air Force was covering up the fact that alien bodies were recovered from a flying saucer crash. Well, I still remember the Air Force officials said, wait a minute, it was a weather balloon. That's all it was, a weather balloon. And then the critics said, now wait a minute, why would the Air Force cover it up if it was just a weather balloon? And then the Air Force official kind of like hemmed and hawed, because if it is just a weather balloon, Project Mogul, that crashed, why the cover-up? Why this elaborate PR effect? Well, it turns out that the military, over the years, would actually deliberately, tantalizingly talk about flying saucers in order to deflect criticism of the stealth bomber. The stealth bomber was being perfected in areas like Area 51, and the military wanted to keep top secret some of our experiments on the stealth bomber, so they deliberately floated flying saucer stories. But something then came out a few years after that. A few years after that, in Albuquerque, the press here noted the fact that the military conducted top secret experiments on radiation dispersal using unknowing American citizens as guinea pigs. The United States military would release radioactive materials in populated areas like Cincinnati, for example. Think about it. Radioactive debris being thrown into the air so that the military could trace and track the flow of these volatile radioactive materials in the atmosphere without permission of U.S. citizens. We were the guinea pigs. And apparently that's one of the reasons why the military hushed up a weather balloon, because they didn't want people to probe deeper to find out that the military was actually experimenting on the U.S. population, shooting radioactive materials into people's backyards, into the atmosphere, just to see how radiation spreads in the environment. Well, people sometimes say that maybe history is repeating itself again. Vladimir Putin just a few months ago announced the fact that the Russians are perfecting a new type of weapon, the hypersonic drive. It is a vehicle that can travel many times faster than the speed of sound, not just supersonic, but hypersonic, capable of evading any ground radar. That's why they're doing it. And the military in the United States and the Chinese then were also forced to admit that they too are working on hypersonic drives, and maybe that's what's buzzing our aircraft. Our aircraft sometimes says something is buzzing them faster than any known vehicle that we know of, maybe is hypersonic drive. Well, who knows for sure, but let's continue now, because we're going to throw the lines open and you can get on Science Fantastic. Give us a call. The hotline number once again is 612-564-8135. Ask that question, make that comment, and have your thoughts heard on almost 100 radio stations that carry Science Fantastic. Okay, let's move on and take the first listener phone call.
Hi, this is Armand from Queens, New York, and I listen to you on YouTube. I watch these murder mysteries, and they usually give the suspect a polygraph. But I've heard that polygraphs aren't that accurate. So what are your speculations on that? And do you think there's new technology, coming that can be more effective than the polygraph, like brain scan or something like that? Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Well, yes. Ever since ancient times, people have wondered, how do you detect if someone is lying to you? During the Middle Ages, for example. During the Middle Ages, somebody would grab both wrists and check your pulse in your wrist and then ask you questions. If you begin to hesitate, act nervous, and sweat, you could detect that because your pulse rate went up because somebody was holding both wrists as you were being interrogated. So that was crude, but it was a way in which you could detect increase in blood pressure, which does correspond to lying in certain circumstances. Today, we have a battery of ways in which we can so-called detect lies. We can look at, for example, sweat. Sweat is salt water. Salt water conducts electricity. So by analyzing the conductivity of your skin by putting two small electrodes on your skin, you can detect whether or not you're sweating, and therefore whether or not you are, quote, telling a lie. Your breathing rate, your heartbeat, the conductivity of your skin, any number of ways are put together to create a polygraph which can be beaten. if you can psychologically control your body so that you don't tense up, you don't start to sweat, get nervous, but you distract yourself by thinking about the seashore or birds or thinking about something else, you can actually train yourself to defeat a polygraph. And now we have brain scans. Get a copy of my book, The Future of the Mind, and you'll be shocked to find out how much materials that we can actually get from the living brain. By looking at blood flow in the brain, we can actually see thoughts as they're being created in the living brain. This is amazing. This means that old wives' tales can actually be proven to be correct in some cases. Many parents believe, for example, that teenagers suffer from brain damage. Well, that's partly true. Brain scans of the prefrontal cortex of teenagers show that it's not fully developed. So their ability to evaluate risk-taking is faulty. And that's why teenagers take unnecessary risks. Another old wives' tale that you can show by using brain scans, well, many people believe that when a man talks to a pretty girl, he starts to act stupid. Well, if you brain scan someone who's talking to a pretty girl, sure enough, blood drains from the prefrontal cortex, and the man starts to stutter and act mentally retarded. So this is actually a biological mechanism that you can measure, quantify, something that most people believe, and that when a man talks to a pretty girl, he starts to act stupid. Well, can you use this as a lie detector? That's the question, and we'll answer that question after the break. Once again, you are listening to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. After the break, we'll answer the question, can you brain scan somebody and tell if they're lying to you? Once again, give us a call at 612-564-8135, and maybe you can get on Science Fantastic. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Give us a call and you can have your thoughts heard on national radio. The number to call is 612-564-8135. We've archived previous shows of Science Fantastic. The website is mkaku.org, mkaku.org. I've written 4 New York Times bestsellers, and one of them is The Future of the Mind, where I do talk about brain scans, using brain scans as a lie detector test. And the question is, how accurate are they anyway? Well, it turns out that when you look at brain scans of the human brain, when you tell a lie, it registers the usual thing. The brain, of course, controls sweating activity involuntarily, sweating activity, pulse rate. You can pick that up on a brain scan. But lying and telling the truth or telling a lie, we have not found the center in the brain that does that. Maybe there is no center of the brain that does that. We don't know. But at the present time, we have not located that point of the brain where if you tell a lie, it begins to light up. So when people say that with 99% accuracy, brain scans can detect liars, well, that's kind of stretching it. Brain scans can detect a lot of things, which you can also detect using ordinary polygraphs. But brain scans are still primitive. We're in the beginning stages. Maybe eventually we'll find that center of the brain that regulates truth and untruth. But right now, we have not yet found it. So don't believe it when people say that with 99% accuracy, we can use MRI scans as lie detectors. That's not to say that it won't be possible in the future, but at the present time, brain scans are still in their infancy. Okay, well, let's move on to the next listener phone call.
My name is Abigail, and my question is, why do planets with larger mass have a different amount of gravity than planets with smaller mass? Thank you. I'll listen to the answer on.
Well, it was Isaac Newton himself who figured out that the larger the planet, the more the gravity. In fact, he found the precise relationship between gravity and mass. The force between two objects is proportional to the masses of these objects divided by the distance squared times a constant, the universal gravitational constant. Using that equation, bingo, he was able to calculate calculate the motion of comets, like Halley's Comet. That was a tremendous victory for science because people didn't know what guided the planets, and especially they didn't know where comets came from. But using Newton's laws, you could actually calculate the trajectory, the future trajectory of Halley's Comet, and then Halley was able to predict when Halley's Comet would return back to light up the skies over London. But you ask a slightly deeper question. Why? Why is it that gravity is related to mass? Well, now we have yet another theory, Einstein's theory, that takes it one step farther, and that is that mass warps the space around it. The bigger the mass, the more the warping, the more the distortion of an object moving in the gravitational field. So objects move in a curved line going around the sun, like the Earth, because the sun has warped the space around the Earth. And that's why the Earth goes around the sun. In fact, that's why you're sitting in your chair right now. How come you're not floating? How come you're not being hurled 1,000 miles per hour into outer space? Because that's the velocity that you are traveling at right now. You are traveling at 1,000 miles per hour. The Earth's circumference is 24,000 miles. And there are 24 hours in a day. So bingo, you divide and you get the fact that you're moving at 1,000 miles per hour. So why? Not because gravity is pulling you down, that's what Newton would say, but because space is pushing you down. So to summarize Einstein's theory of general relativity in one sentence, it is that gravity does not pull, space pushes. And then you may ask yet another question. Why is that? Why is that? Why is it that the larger the mass, the greater the warping, and the greater the gravitational attraction? Well, the answer to that is we don't know. Sorry about that. That is a postulate given to us by Newton and now by Einstein. Where does that come from? We think that eventually comes from string theory. But then you may ask another embarrassing question. Where does string theory come from? Well, at that point, I plead guilty. I don't know. And for that matter, neither does any physicist on the planet Earth. Okay, well, let's move on now to take the next listener phone call.
Hey, this is Dave P., 1340 KPRK, Livingston, Montana. My question to you is, what is your opinion on wormholes? Do you think that it's something that someday we can exploit and actually use? Do they exist? And please give me your opinion. Thank you.
Well, if you want to see a wormhole in graphic detail, look at Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Whenever Star Trek Deep Space Nine begins, it opens up with a wormhole that looks very much like a whirlpool or a funnel. Well, unfortunately, that's not what a wormhole looks like. Sorry about that. But in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, wormholes are gateways to another point of the galaxy, which occur naturally. So they're not artificial, they're created naturally. They're found, and when you find them, they can become a very cheap gateway to the other sector of the galaxy. Well, what does the science say about these things? Well, wormholes were first introduced by Albert Einstein himself. Yes, it was 1935 that Einstein wrote a famous paper with his students, Nathan Rosen, called the Einstein-Rosen bridge paper. He took two black holes, which sort of resemble a funnel, stuck them back to back. Take two funnels, cut them, stick them back to back, and if you fall into one funnel, you fall out of the other funnel. That is a wormhole. It's a gateway. It's a shortcut through space and time. Now, Einstein himself did not think that we could create a wormhole. Of course, he was playing with black holes, so it would take the energy of a black hole. But he did believe that this was very interesting because they were solutions of Einstein's equations. So think of Alice's looking glass. The looking glass of Alice is the wormhole. Alice sits in Oxford England. On the other side is the Mad Hatter in Wonderland. And by going through the looking glass, you instantly are transported to another point in the universe. Well, you can also use this as a time machine as well. In fact, my colleague Stephen Hawking, who recently passed away, posthumously has published a book. And in the book, he says, well, he's backtracking a bit. He now believes that time travel through wormholes may be possible. He used to say it was not possible, but he has since backtracked. And his latest book, written posthumously, says that perhaps wormholes can also be used as time machines. Now, what's the catch? There's always a catch someplace, otherwise somebody would have built one of these damn things years ago, right? The catch is, well, as Einstein himself realized, to create a wormhole, you need fabulous amounts of positive energy, like a black hole, and then negative energy to stabilize it, to keep it open. So it was Einstein himself who realized that positive energy, in the form of a black hole, might rip the fabric of space and time. But Stephen Hawking had a mathematical proof showing that if you have enough negative energy, you can stabilize it, keep it stable so you can walk back and forth and not be crushed, or the wormhole wouldn't collapse on you like as it does sometimes on Star Trek, that you could keep the gateway open. So the catch is, of course, we do not have the ability to manipulate the energy of a black hole, and we can only create microscopic, minuscule quantities of negative energy in the laboratory, and so we're far, far away from being able to use the power of a wormhole. But are they possible? Yes. Do we know for sure? Well, no, because ultimately we have to rely on a higher theory to stabilize the black hole, and that theory is string theory. That's what I do for a living. That's my day job. Unfortunately, string theory is not yet advanced enough to answer all these questions. It gives us tantalizing clues that these questions are answerable, but the mathematics is horrendous. I know because I work on it. The mathematics is horrendous. At the present time, no one can conclusively say that wormholes exist and are stable. Now, some physicists have published articles saying that maybe they can be found naturally, like in Star Trek. The Big Bang inflated a tiny piece of the universe, and maybe there was a wormhole there, in which case the wormhole would have been inflated too, giving us a naturally occurring wormhole, just like in Deep Space Nine. Well, let's take another short commercial break. Once again, you are listening to Science Fantastic. Give us a call at 612-564-8135 and ask that question. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Yes, if you want to get on Science Fantastic and ask that question that you've always wanted to ask, give us a call at 612-564-8135. You'll get a recording. When you hear the recording, leave your name, call letters of the radio station, if you're listening to one, and the city you're calling from, and then ask away. Ask that question. Make that comment that's always been bothering you. You know, many people, when they walk down the street, they're clueless, absolutely clueless about the world around them. Why does the wind blow? Where does the weather come from? How old are the mountains? Why do the stars shine? How far are they? How old is the universe, and where did it come from? We're like leaves in the wind, just clueless about the basics of where we are in the universe. Well, I'm a physicist. I can answer every single one of those questions. And if you have one of these questions, why not ask it on national radio? Some people think, well, my question is too dumb. People are going to laugh. Well, chances are, if you have a question, chances are thousands of other people have that same dumb question. And so it's okay to ask it on national radio because a lot of people probably have exactly the same question. So give us a call at 612-564-8135. Go to my website. We've archived previous shows. The website is mkaku.org, mkaku.org. And it lists all the radio stations that take Science Fantastic. Okay, let's move on now and take the next listener phone call.
Hello, my name is William. I am calling from Port Orange, Florida. I'm listening to what looks like WNDB 93.5. My question is in regards to light behaving as a wave and a particle or a particle. I've seen some videos and read some explanations about how it changes its behavior when there's an observer, so in other words, the observer effect. And I have also heard some explanations that when it is observed, it's really just measured, and the act of measuring does something to it that makes it behave as a particle and or wave again. So I was just wondering if it is something that science is just assuming that when they are observed that it changes its behavior, or if there is actual scientific proof that the observation messes with the experiment and collapses the wave function. Thank you very much. I love science.
Well, the answer to your questions is yes. Yes, 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 yes. Next question. Well, let me answer them one at a time now and break it down. First of all, the ancients used to wonder, what is light anyway? How fast does it move? What is it? It's such a fantastic thing, light. Well, we could actually answer all those questions now. Well, first of all, Newton thought that light was a particle. It was a particle that when it went through a prism would break up into colors, giving us the rainbow, but it was particulate. It was a particle. Then came other experiments where we showed that light waves can interfere with other light waves, and maybe that's what's happening with light. And so we began to think that light had a frequency, it had a wavelength, and it was vibrations. Then finally, in the 1860s, James Clerk Maxwell, a theoretical physicist in Cambridge University, made one of the greatest insights in the history of science, which made modern technology possible. All of it because of Maxwell. However, let's take a short commercial break, and after the break, we'll try to answer the question, what the hell is light anyway? Is it a wave? Is it a particle? Is something in between? What is it? Well, give us a call. The hotline number is 612-564-8135, and you can ask that question on national radio. Give us a call. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Give us a call. The hotline number is 612-564-8135. And before the break, we had a very important question, which goes to the heart of modern physics today and why modern physics is so bizarre. Why is the quantum theory one of the weirdest theories ever proposed? And yet we need the quantum theory. Without the quantum theory, well, there's no radio, there's no television, there's no electronics. Modern technology, the transistor, lasers, all of it depends upon the quantum theory. And it boils down to a simple question. Is light a particle or a wave? Newton thought light was a particle. Other people showed that light has wave-like properties. It has a wavelength, it has a frequency, and it's very similar to other forms of electromagnetic radiation. And the next big step was taken in the 1860s by James Clerk Maxwell. He showed that if I take an electric field and vibrate it, it creates a magnetic field. And if I take a magnet and shake a magnet, it creates an electric field. So then he asked a key question. If I vibrate an electric field to create a magnetic field, which creates an electric field to create a magnetic field, then does it propagate? Does it move all by itself? Well, he showed that it does. A wave like ripples on a pond, forms out of magnetism and electricity. And then he calculated the speed of that wave, and he was shocked. Absolutely shocked. This is one of the greatest breakthroughs in the history of Homo sapiens. He found that vibrating electric and magnetic fields that you can create in your own living room, the vibrations travel at the speed of light. And then he uttered the most important words of all time. He said, maybe this is light. And he was right. Light is an electromagnetic wave. When it vibrates even faster, it turns into ultraviolet radiation. When it vibrates slower, it turns into infrared. In fact, if you vibrate it at different frequencies, it turns into television, radio, ultraviolet, gamma rays, all all the colors, all the radiations that you hear about, can be summarized by vibrating electric and magnetic fields. The next breakthrough came with the quantum theory. And it was Einstein himself who said that light is based on photons, particles. So now we had a conflict. We had a war raging in physics, where Newton and Einstein said that light was a particle. Everyone else said, no, it's a wave. We can refract it, reflect it. It has a wavelength. We know everything about waves. So who's right? Well, actually, both are right. It was Max Born, the physicist, who finally put these two things together in a way that Einstein hated. Sorry about that, but Albert was wrong on this one. It turns out that light is a particle. It is made out of photons. Photons are particles of light. So to answer your question, is light a particle or a wave? Well, it's a particle. But the probability of finding the particle at any given point is given by a wave. So if the wave is strong at a certain point, it's likely to be there. Well, Einstein hated that idea. What? Likely? Probability? Chance? Come on, give me a break. The march of science, said Einstein, was to reduce uncertainty, to eliminate all the likelihoods of this and the likelihoods of that, to get definitive answers. So Einstein thought that the universe consisted of tiny little steel balls. These little steel balls, you knew exactly where they were. You knew their velocity, the position, no ifs, ands, or buts. That's the common sense point of view, by the way. You consciously or unconsciously think that everything is made out of definite little objects. You know exactly where they are, when they are, end of story. Well, sorry about that. That's not true. The quantum theory says that light has with it a wave, and the wave tells you where it is most likely to be found. So if the wave maximum in a certain area, then chances are that's where it is. That's called the uncertainty principle, that you don't really know where anything is at any given point, meaning that an electron, you don't really know where it is. It could be two places at the same time. Now, at this point, you may say to yourself, whoa, stop right there. Two places at the same time? Well, yes, two places at the same time. And what are the practical applications of this? Transistors, lasers, diodes, computers, iPods, the internet, all of them based upon this bizarre idea that electrons can be two places at the same time, and the probability of finding that damn electron is given by a wave. This is amazing. When I look at myself in a mirror, I realize, first of all, I'm not really looking at myself at all. I'm looking at myself, first of all, a billionth of a second ago. Let's take another short commercial break, and let's get back to Science Fantastic. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Before the break, we have one of the great paradoxes of all time. How can you be two places at the same time? Well, that's the way it is, folks. That's the way the universe operates. Now, the questioner asked, do you have to make a measurement to find out where that particle is? And yes, you have to make a measurement. And in that sense, that determines where the electron is. Now, at this point, Einstein really flipped out and said, are you saying that the process of measurement, which determines consciousness, that consciousness determining measurement determines the position of a particle? Well, Einstein hated that. What? Consciousness determining existence? Einstein thought that existence was totally independent of thought. Well, according to the Bohr interpretation, objects exist at a definite place when you make a measurement, and that requires consciousness. Now, what do modern physicists say? Most of my friends, some of them Nobel Prize winners, believe in the many worlds interpretation, and that is that the universe splits in half. The electron is one place in one universe, but the electron could be another place in another universe. The universe is constantly splitting apart, and that's how you get around all the paradoxes of the quantum theory. That you don't have to have consciousness to make a measurement to determine where something is. Something is in many places because the universe splits into parallel universes. Now, if you want to know more about this, get a copy of my book, Parallel Worlds, where I talk about this. Now, does this mean that some people who have died in our universe are still alive in another universe? Well, this may freak some people out, but the answer to that is yes. In the multiverse interpretation, you can die in one universe and still live in another universe. Now, what's the catch? There's always a catch someplace. The catch is the probability of meeting that dead person is extremely small. So small that it's not going to happen in the lifetime of the universe. So chances are, if you've died in our universe, that even if you are alive in another universe, you'll never be able to go back to the original universe you came from. Sorry about that. Okay, well, let's move on to the next listener phone call.
Hello, Professor Kaku. This is Jesse from Houston. I watch you on YouTube, watch your podcast, and listen to questions and everything. It's pretty helpful. It's very helpful, actually. I had a couple questions for you about the Parker Solar Probe. I know we're going to launch that pretty soon, a couple days, I think, a few days from now. And I understand what it does and what it's going to do and all that, but what do you think that we're going to find new particles that we've never seen before, so since we're so close to the sun, or new elements or new things that we don't know about that's going to ask more questions? And the other question was, what are we going to do with that probe? Is it going to come back to Earth, or is it going to do like a kamikaze mission like Cassini did with Cassini? Did it, are they going to do that with the Parker Solar Probe or no? Because I've never heard anything about it, so I was just seeing if you knew any more about it, and about new elements that might show up with the Parker Solar Probe.
Well, the short answer is no. We're not going to find new particles. New particles would require another large hadron collider, a $10 billion machine outside Switzerland. However, we hope to find answers to many mysteries of our sun. For example, there was a mini ice age during the medieval period. Paintings done during the Middle Ages show that certain lakes were frozen over, lakes which are not frozen over today. People are ice skating on these frozen lakes. Temperatures dropped tremendously during the certain period of the Middle Ages called the mini ice age. Some people think that the variation in the sun's intensity caused that. Also, giant solar flares could wipe out communications and cause tremendous disruption on the Earth. The Carrington event of 1859, Google it, Carrington event, created so much solar activity that it wiped out telegraph transmissions on the Earth. The northern lights, usually seen at the North Pole, could be seen in Cuba. That's how powerful the radiation was from the sun. If that radiation from the Carrington event were to happen again, all hell would break loose. Property damage, $2 trillion in property damage. We'd have blackouts everywhere. Food riots would break out. Communications would go down. The internet, weather satellites, everything would go down. It would be horrible. We would be thrown back maybe 100 years into the past if another Carrington event were to happen. Could it happen again? The answer is yes. But why? I mean, how often would it happen again? It turns out that several years ago, we just missed a solar flare that could have given us another Carrington event. How often are they? We don't know the answer to a lot of those questions. So we hope to find the answer by sending probes near the sun. And, well, unfortunately, many of these probes are not going to come back. Sorry about that. Okay, let's move on now to the next listener phone call.
Hi, Dr. Kaku. This is Ken. I'd like to ask about whether or not Lewis Carroll had any influence on relativity theory. As I understand it, he, in his second book of Alice, he wrote down that Alice was walking down this road that constantly changed the direction and constantly warped the path, so that when she was trying to leave a house, the road itself would change so that she would re-enter the house. The way he described it was very similar to the way relativity is described in Einstein's work. I'd like to know that, being that Lewis Carroll was a mathematician, did he have any role in the invention of relativity? Thank you.
Well, first of all, Lewis Carroll was not Lewis Carroll. He was Charles Dodgson. He wrote under a pen name because distinguished Oxford professors of mathematics are not supposed to write children's books. which then became a monster bestseller. Queen Victoria read Alice in Wonderland. Alice in Wonderland has wormholes, for example. The Looking Glass of Alice is a wormhole predicted by Einstein in 1935. But was there a direct relationship between Alice in Wonderland and Albert Einstein? To the best of our knowledge, no. We know many of the influences that influenced Einstein. One of them was a children's book. When he was a child, a children's book asked the question, what happens if you could ride alongside a telegraph wire, or ride alongside electricity in a telegraph wire? Einstein, as a 16-year-old child, changed that into a light beam, and from that got special relativity. Okay, well, unfortunately, we have run out of time. Once again, this is Science Fantastic. Give us a call at 612-564-8135, and maybe you can get on National Radio.
This is Science Fantastic.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we profile the amazing, jaw-dropping scientific discoveries which are revolutionizing our world and touching our lives. And in this hour, once again, we're going to throw the lines open because this hour is for you, the listener. How many times have you been watching the TV, listening to the radio, surfing the web, and something captures your imagination about science? Something about space, about astronomy, about DNA, about health, about cancer research, about everyday things that grab your attention, but you have nobody to talk to. You're all by yourself watching the TV, surfing the web. You're all by yourself. Well, you can talk to me. That's right. You can give me a call by calling 612-564-8135, and you can get on Science Fantastic. That's right. Write that number down, 612-564-8135, and maybe your thoughts could be heard on national radio. Just leave your name, call letters of the radio station if you're listening to one, and the city you're calling from, and then ask away. Make that comment, make that question, and just maybe you can get on national radio. Let's say you're talking to the kids at dinner time, and the kids have a science question, a homework question, and it leaves you stumped. What are you going to do? You're going to get to the telephone and call 612-564-8135. And why don't you put them on the telephone? Why don't you have them ask that question and have that science question heard on national radio? And some people say, come on, I can't do that. I'm too shy. Well, then send me email. Email address, well, first of all, go to my website, mkaku.org, mkaku.org, and find out what I'm up to. I've written 4 New York Times bestsellers. The latest one is called The Future of Humanity, about the future of humanity in outer space as we conquer the universe. So find out more about my work by going to my website, mkaku.org, or my Facebook site at Michio Kaku. And on Facebook, we have over 3 million fans on Facebook. We have over 650,000 fans on Twitter. So find out what all the excitement is about by going to my website and calling that number, 612-564-8135. Okay, well, let's jump right into the first listener phone call.
Hi, Dr. Kaku. My name is Lance Rome. I'm calling from Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I listen to you through your website. I was just wondering, what would happen if 2 big bangs were to collide against each other? I want to eventually write a science fiction book just for fun, and as an attack, that would be something I'm curious about. So, wonder what you were thinking about 2 big bangs colliding each other. What happens in the middle? Thank you.
Well, it turns out that I asked that very same question to my colleague Alan Guth of MIT, who may eventually win the Nobel Prize for the inflation theory of the Big Bang. Now, it turns out that the Big Bang Theory has to have a small correction to it when you start to make it into a quantum theory, because if the Big Bang happened once, it's a quantum theory, it can happen again. There's a certain probability that it could happen again and again and again. Meaning that our universe is a bubble of some sort, but it can spin off baby bubbles like in a bubble bath. And then I asked him a question. Let's say you create a tiny wormhole in an oven. You make an oven in a laboratory, heat it up to a fantastic temperature, trillions of degrees, much hotter than a supernova. At that point, a baby bubble, a baby universe begins to form, and it begins to expand. And then I said to him, what happens if a Big Bang happens in your living room or in your oven? And he very correctly said he's done the calculation. That's right. You can actually see it in the scientific literature. He said the following. First of all, if you heat up space eventually becomes unstable like boiling water. When you heat up water, eventually it starts to boil and bubbles form. Little bubbles form, and these bubbles expand. So if you have an oven and you heat the oven to trillions upon trillions of degrees, little bubbles are going to form. These bubbles are baby universes. And then the next question is that dangerous? Are they going to expand and eat up your universe? Well, no. It turns out that if I have a soap bubble, and the soap bubble starts to spin off a baby soap bubble, the baby soap bubble bulges out in the third dimension. That is, it doesn't take over the original bubble at all. It bulges out into a baby bubble. So instead of one bubble, I have two bubbles that are joined together. And that's what you're asking. What happens at the joint between two universes? First of all, what would you see? If you have an oven and you heat it up to a fantastic degree of energy, a sphere would start to form, which is a baby universe. But the sphere, instead of expanding into your universe, expands into another universe on the other side of forever. In other words, in another dimension. So what do you see? You see your oven getting hotter and hotter. A bubble starts to form. A three-dimensional sphere starts to form. But the sphere only expands to a certain degree and then blows out the other end. Can you see the other end? No, because it's in another dimension. What you see is a bubble that starts to create a baby universe inside its insides. And then I asked him, well, Alan, this is very interesting, but how dangerous? How dangerous is this bubble universe that you just created inside your oven in your backyard or your basement? And he said, well, he did the calculation. Yes, it is dangerous. Yes, you would still feel the effects, and the energy of the recoil would be equivalent to a small hydrogen bomb. So in other words, get the hell out of there. Create the bubble, but run like crazy, because even though the other universe is bulging out in another dimension, the residual energy would be enough to kill you. So in other words, be careful if you make a baby universe in your basement and you become a god. Okay, well, let's move on to the next listener phone call.
Hi, my name is Billy. I'm calling from Collinsville, Illinois, and I mostly listen on YouTube. I have a two-part question. Part one, string theory, from what I understand, that says hyperspace is at least 10-dimensional, but you theorize it's 11. Why? That is to say, why is it that it only needs 10, but you postulate it's 11? Part two of my question is, hyperspace states that our four-dimensional universe is a bubble in hyperspace. Our universe is expanding in all directions infinitely and is actually increasing in its expansion, which scientists attribute to dark energy.
For someone who believes in string theory, if asked what's on the other side of our universe, the answer I would imagine would simply be hyperspace. That's what we're expanding into. But for someone who believes...
Okay, well, unfortunately, we got to take a short commercial break. But after the break, we'll talk about hyperspace. We'll talk about 10, 11 dimensions. We'll talk about higher dimensional bubbles and dark energy. All of it after the break. Once again, give us a call at 612-564-8135, and maybe you can get on Science Fantastic. Give us a call. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Give us a call and maybe you can get on national radio. The number to call is 612-564-8135. And once again, go to my website to find out what I'm up to. It's mkaku.org, mkaku.org. On Facebook, we have 3 million fans on Facebook, 650,000 fans on Twitter, and maybe you could make that 3 million plus one. On my Facebook site and the internet site, you can see the books that I've written, 4 New York Times bestsellers. The latest one is called The Future of Humanity. The Future of Humanity in Outer Space. You know that the dinosaurs did not have a space program. And that's why they're not here today to talk about it. We are. We're the lucky ones because we do have a space program. And then the question is our space program up to speed? Will it protect us one day when we inevitably face a catastrophe like what happened when the dinosaurs got wiped out 65 million years ago when a rock plowed into Mexico and wiped out the dinosaurs? So give us a call. 612-564-8135 is the number to call. Leave that message by making that question and making that comment and putting it on radio. Well, we had a question before the break, and the question is rather advanced, so let me try to break it down. First of all, what do I do for a living? My paycheck comes from the city and state of New York because I work on something called string theory. String theory, we think, is a theory that eluded Einstein for the last 30 years of his life, a theory of everything. Each vibration of a tiny, tiny, tiny little string corresponds to a subatomic particle, and that's why we have so many subatomic particles. So physics is now reduced to the laws of harmony of vibrating strings. Chemistry is the melodies you can write on vibrating strings. The universe is a symphony of strings, and then the mind of God. The mind of God that eluded Einstein for the last 30 years of his life. The mind of God would be cosmic music resonating through hyperspace, 10-dimensional hyperspace. Now, we live in a 3-dimensional universe, but there could be hidden dimensions out there, because if our universe is a bubble of some sort, even children ask the question, what is the bubble expanding into? Well, our bubble is expanding into hyperspace. We think 10-dimensional hyperspace. But, the questioner asked, how come I sometimes say 11-dimensional hyperspace? Well, let me explain. In 10 dimensions, we have 5 string theories that are totally self-consistent and qualify for a theory of everything. Now, we don't like that. We think the universe should be unique in some sense. So why should the universe create not 1, but 5 mathematically self-consistent universes? It sounds a little strange, right? Well, Ed Whitten at Princeton found out the reason why. If you go to one more dimension up into the 11th dimension, and then you squeeze it, you squash one of the dimensions, what do you get? You get 10-dimensional string theory. So think of a beach ball. Think of a beach ball and think of the equator, the rim of the beach ball, and then flatten it out into a pancake. If you flatten the beach ball so that it loses 1 dimension and becomes a flat pancake, it looks like the equator. That is a string. So in other words, a string is a collapsed beach ball, a collapsed membrane. So then the question is, if I live in 11-dimensional hyperspace and I have a membrane or beach ball, how many ways can you squeeze it? Well, you got to talk to a mathematician for that. But the answer is 5 ways. There are 5 ways you can squeeze a beach ball so that it becomes the equator, that is, a string. Well, bingo! Why do we have 5 string theories in 10 dimensions? Because they really are the same thing. This blew the minds of the world's physicists, realizing that the 5 string theories that we work with for 30 years is actually one object, an 11-dimensional membrane of some sort. I like to think of it as an elephant. Think of an elephant. If you were to analyze the trunk of an elephant, you'd say the trunk looks like a 2-dimensional object. If you look at the ears of the elephant, you say it looks like a fan. You put it all together and you get a very strange object. Many ways to create an elephant by looking at the feet, the trunk, the nose. So you would say that there really are 5 different animals. One animal looks like a tree, that is the feet. One animal looks like a snake, that is the nose. One animal looks like a fan, that is the ear. But what is it? Is it 5 different objects? No, it's one. It's an elephant. So in the same way, we think that in 11 dimensions, there is one object that when you slice it up, gives you 5 different string theories. And so, to make a long story short, this dazzled the world of physics, realizing that maybe the universe is unique. Maybe there's one and only one way to create a universe that satisfies all the criteria that we need to create a unified field theory. Well, the questioner also had another question about 4-dimensional bubbles. Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to listen to all of it, but let me explain really briefly what he was getting at. Why does the universe expand? The universe expands because there's something called dark energy pushing the galaxies apart. So even nothingness has energy, dark energy, and it pushes the galaxy apart. And the question is, can string theory explain this? Well, yes and no. It turns out that if you simply calculate one way in which to derive a 4-dimensional universe from string theory, there are many ways to do it. In one way, you can get our universe. But, to be fair, there are other ways of reducing the 11-dimensional theory down to 4 dimensions. So there is more than one universe. This is called the multiverse theory, and it means that in some sense, string theory cannot yet calculate exactly the amount of dark energy in the universe unless you put it in by hand, and we don't like that. So in other words, string theory is not finished yet. It's not in its finished mathematical form. And if you were listening to this show, perhaps one day you may have that insight to allow us to complete the theory and calculate exactly the amount of dark energy in the universe. Maybe somebody listening to this show will one day figure out the theory of everything. Okay, well, let's move right on to the next listener phone call.
Hi, Dr. Kaku. This is Ken. I'm calling to ask you if it's possible to have more than 2 time dimensions. I know that time can move perpendicular to each other. Is it possible to have like 3 or 4 time dimensions or infinite dimensions? Or if there are any other kinds of elements of the cosmos beyond space or time or space-time? Thank you for your time.
Well, at first that question sounds weird, preposterous, and stupid. Actually, it's a subject of intense debate among theoretical physicists. You see, string theory, which is the leading theory for the theory of everything, has 9 spatial dimensions that you can move in, and 1 time dimension. Okay, you got that? 9 plus 1 equals 10. That's string theory. However, at Harvard, we have another group that says that if you allow for 2 times, not 1, but 2 times, Then the theory becomes even prettier and even more elegant in 12-dimensional hyperspace. So the mind starts to boggle at that point. What would a two-time universe look like? Well, once I saw a movie on one of these old movie stations, and David Niven, the British actor, got shot down over the Atlantic, and he went to heaven. However, in heaven, when St. Peter began to write down what we knew about this guy, heaven found out it made a mistake. He wasn't supposed to die. Well, we'll talk about that after the break. Once again, you are listening to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Give us a call. The hotline number is 612-564-8135. And then ask that question, and maybe you can get on national radio. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. The lines are open. You're not going to get a busy signal. You'll get right to us. Give us a call at 612-564-8135. You'll hear a recording. At the sound of the recording, leave your name, call letter to the radio station if you're listening to one, and the city you're calling from, and then ask that question. Make that comment that's always been bothering you, and perhaps your thoughts will be heard on national radio. So once again, give us a call and have your thoughts heard on national radio. Well, before the break, we had a call concerning dark energy, so let me explain really quick. It turns out that even nothingness, pure nothingness, has a small amount of energy associated with it. Now, some crackpots claim that they can use that energy to create a solution to the energy crisis. Nope, doesn't work that way. You can calculate that the 0-point energy is very small, very, very tiny. But over galactic distances, it of course is very big because space is very big. And that energy is sufficient to push the galaxies apart. In fact, that's why the Big Bang is banging. That's why the universe is expanding. But the calculation of dark energy has eluded physicists up to now. What is the mismatch? The mismatch between theory and experiment is 10 to the 120. Now take out a sheet of paper, write down the number 1, and then write 120 zeros after that 1. That's the mismatch between theory and experiment. Now, that's embarrassing. I mean, this is the biggest embarrassment in all of science. The biggest mismatch in all of science is 10 to the 120, 1 with 120 zeros after it. The mismatch between the experimental value of dark energy and the theoretical value of dark energy. So what are you going to do? If you ever find the solution to the dark energy problem, you're going to call me, and, well, I'm a generous man. I'll split the Nobel Prize with you. Okay? That's what it's worth. It's worth the Nobel Prize if you can figure out why dark energy is so dark and so energetic. Okay, well, let's move right on now to the next listener phone call.
Hello, Professor Kaku. This is Jesse from Houston. I watch you on YouTube. I've asked a couple questions already, and you straightened me out on some of them. I had another question about future humanity. I just saw your podcast, the one that you recently put on YouTube, and you had an interview, and I think it was in 2015 or something. But anyway, you were talking about your book, Future Humanity. And I had a question about future humanity. Like when we eventually go to Mars, when people, regular people are on Mars, not just astronauts or scientists, regular people on Mars, what kind of regulations do you think there will be in place for Mars? Is it going to be a new slate? Is it going to be like, okay, no drugs, no, no this, no that, like the problems on Earth? Or is it going to be sort of the same rules, same regulations as Earth, or is it going to be a whole new process because it's a whole new planet? You know, we can start clean or whatever.
Well, to answer your question, initially there are going to be lots of rules and regulations because if you make a mistake, you could destroy the entire Martian colony. So let's take a short commercial break, and after that we're going to talk about rules and regulations if you live on Mars. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again, if you want to get on Science Fantastic, you can give us a call. That's 612-564-8135. Well, before the break, we had a call about what it would be like to live on Mars. Would we have the same kinds of laws, restrictions, and you can't do this, you can't do that, rules of thumb? Or would it be freer on Mars? Well, yes and no. In some sense, things are going to be more restrictive if you are a colonist on Mars. In other ways, you'll have more freedom than you can possibly imagine. Initially, there are going to be lots of restrictions if you live as a colonist on Mars. But eventually, there could be unparalleled freedoms as well. Now, let's be clear about this. If you are one of the early colonists on Mars, you cannot pollute. You cannot endanger the entire colony by being wasteful and doing dangerous things. So, for example, smoking or getting access to oxygen in a very secure area. You could cause a fire, an explosion, which would be disastrous. Absolutely disastrous in a small colony. You can endanger all the colonists. And you have to make sure that you eat a certain amount of food because you don't want to exhaust the food supply of the colony. And you don't want to pollute. Especially you don't want to pollute because it's going to pollute the water supply, which is very precious on Mars. So initially, there are going to be lots of restrictions, common sense restrictions, in order to preserve the safety of the entire colony. One little mistake can expose you to a loss of oxygen, to fires, to a loss of food, and create problems that endanger the entire colony. However, that said, ultimately, there could be a freedom unparalleled since the days of the pioneers. Realize that Mars is wide open. Wide open, just like the early colonists found things wide open when they explored new territories. And there could be new ventures in tourist areas, in areas that are spectacular compared to areas on the planet Earth. For example, mountains of Mars would be much taller than mountains on the Earth. Mount Everest would look rather puny on Mars because of the weak gravitational field, meaning that mountains can become much larger than mountains here found on the planet Earth. So the Grand Canyon of Mars, for example, is about the size of the United States of America. Now think about that for a moment. Our Grand Canyon is a dot on a map compared to the size of the United States. However, on Mars, its Grand Canyon, the Mars Mariner Valley, is roughly the size of the United States of America. So you can see that there are volcanoes, mountain ranges, canyons, much bigger and more spectacular than anything found on the planet Earth. And you are free to explore these things in a way that you cannot explore on the planet Earth. Okay, let's move on now to the next listener phone call.
This is Lee from Bozeman, Montana, listening to KNMS 1450. I'm curious about shooting stars. How can we see a star that is shooting across the sky? Thank you.
Okay, well, that shooting star that you see whipping across the sky is not really a star at all. It's a small piece of debris, perhaps the size of a marble or maybe the size of a table, and it is burning up when it hits the atmosphere of the planet Earth. So the meteor itself is the streak of light that goes across the heavens. It only lasts for about a second or so, and it burns up because it's a piece of rock, probably from the asteroid belt, that heats up because of the friction when it encounters the air of the Earth. Now, stars are totally different. Our entire Earth, for example, orbits around our sun. Our sun is a star. In fact, it's a rather typical star. But stars light up the heavens. So unlike meteors, which only dance across the night sky for a second or so, stars burn for billions of years. And that's eventually where we came from. Okay, well, let's take another short commercial break. Once again, you are listening to Science Fantastic. Give us a call at 612-564-8135 and then ask that question. Make that comment, and maybe your thoughts will be heard on national radio. Give us a call. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. If you want to be part of the March of Science, then give us a call. The number to call is 612-564-8135. So why should we scientists have all the fun? We have all the fun probing the secrets of Mother Nature, of understanding the stars and the universe and the galaxies. We have all the fun probing into the microverse of DNA, of germs and viruses and life itself. Why shouldn't you be part of the fun? So give us a call. The hotline number is 612-564-8135. And also go to my website. I'm at mkaku.org, mkaku.org. My Facebook site is Michio Kaku. We have over 3 million fans on Facebook. And check out the 4 New York Times bestsellers that I've written. The Future of Humanity, about the future of the space program. The Future of the Mind, talking about how we physicists are now probing the secrets of the living brain. Also, Physics of the Impossible, talking about, well, Star Trek and science fiction, talking about time travel and teleportation, and also Physics of the Future, talking about robots, cancer research, longevity, talking about all the developments that make the headlines. So find out more by going to my website, mkaku.org, and finding out what all the excitement is about. Okay, let's move on now to the next listener phone call.
Hello, my name is Jeremy Yas. I'm from Chicago. I just want to ask, how much energy is in the universe? Thanks.
Well, you ask an embarrassing question, and I'll try to make a stab at it. First of all, we don't even know the size of the universe. We know the density of the universe, that is how much energy and matter there is in a cubic centimeter. So, for example, if you were to have a piece of gas and highlight every molecule in that gas and make every molecule the size of, let's say, a basketball, that would be the rough density of space-time. So you realize that the Earth is an exception. We're quite dense here on the planet Earth, but in outer space, hydrogen atoms are only as common as basketballs. And so that's how rare the density of the Earth, of the universe is. Then the next question is, well, how big is the entire universe? We don't really know. However, inflation theory is the most rigorous theory of the Big Bang. Inflation theory is actually compatible both with the universe starting from a dot as well as the universe starting from an infinite sheet. So to answer your question, we really don't even know how big the universe is. And then the question is, what is the total amount of matter energy in the universe? That, we think, could be very close to zero. So let me explain. Matter has positive energy to do work. Gravity has negative energy because you have to add energy in order to go into empty space. Now, how much positive and negative energy is there? Well, it's very close to zero. That is, the total amount of matter and energy in the universe is very close to zero. So it takes no energy to create a baby universe. Now, in string theory, we believe in a multiverse of universes. Some people have criticized that. They say that that's very wasteful, because where is all the energy going to come from to populate all these other universes. But you see, that misses the point. The net energy of each universe is probably zero. The total amount of space in the universe and the total amount of matter in the universe add up. And when you add up those two, you get zero. So in other words, we don't really know the answer to your question. The best we can say is we know the average density of the universe, and the total amount of energy in the entire universe, including matter, could be zero. So the embarrassing thing is we have no definitive answer yet to your question. A lot of theories, but no definitive answer. Okay, let's move on to the next listener phone call.
Hey, this is Brandon from Manhattan, and I was wondering, what are Fermi bubbles? I read something about it. I'm not sure exactly what they're about, but I'm also listening to you on YouTube, and I love your show, and have a great day. Bye.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I'm not exactly sure precisely what you mean because it could refer to several things, but let me explain. Enrico Fermi was one of the great quantum physicists who helped to create what we call nuclear physics. For example, he created the first nuclear reactor at the University of Chicago. He helped to build the atomic bomb. And he realized that there are two kinds of particles, fermions and bosons. A fermion is like an electron. Its spin is 1/2 of Planck's constant. So the electron spins, and it's a very small amount, but it is consistent with what is called a fermion. So an electron, a proton, and a quark are all fermions. However, there are also bosons. Bosons have integer spins, not 1/2, but 1, 2, and 3. So we have two kinds of particles. One particle that makes up matter. The electrons, the proton, these are the fermions. And then we have the bosons, which make up the forces. Light and gravity are made out of bosons. Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time. So once again, this is Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku, and give us a call. The number to call is 612-564-8135, and maybe you can get on national radio. So give us a call, and maybe you can get on Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku.